It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on your show, and you pronounced my name very well, so thank you. Sure. Well, the name itself is Sanskrit, and it has a lot of spiritual significance. The actual name portion, so my actual name is Dharma Pravartaka, which means he who sets Dharma in motion. Sri is just an honorific. It's kind of like saying Mr. or Mrs. in English. And then Acharya is my title, and Acharya is a spiritual preceptor. So this is a very ancient title that's used in the Vedic tradition, meaning an individual who is a philosopher in the Vedic tradition. Sure, absolutely. Well, the word dharma is a very ancient term. It too, like my name, is Sanskrit. And it's a word that's not translated easily into English, but if you had to translate it, the way that I do is essentially natural law, or you could say the natural way. And it's the idea that there is indeed a natural order that is there, that is upholding the fabric of our cosmos, and that natural order, that natural law, is something that intelligent, wise, healthy individuals are meant to live in accordance with. And if we do, then we have prosperity, a healthy society, etc. So that essentially is the idea of dharma. The word Veda, it's a very interesting word. Actually, it's interesting. I was giving a talk last night where I was going very in depth into just the meaning of this word alone. Veda has several meanings. The primary meaning is knowledge, but eternal knowledge, not just factual knowledge. Not just factual knowledge like what my age is or the fact that there's a car parked outside, but rather the kind of knowledge that is meant by this word Veda is knowledge that is eternal, knowledge that is not man-made, knowledge that is always the case. But then the secondary meaning is this. Veda also means the eternal scripture of the Dharmic tradition. We could thus say the Vedic tradition. This is why the Vedic tradition is called the Vedic tradition, is because it's based upon these scriptures known as the Veda. So that is the basis of the Vedic tradition. However, the caveat that I always make in explaining the two terms is this, and every Hindu would agree with this. This is nothing controversial. This is something every scholar of Hinduism would agree with. Essentially, the word Hindu and Hinduism, these two words themselves, are rather recent in origin, meaning no more than maybe, 350 years or so, something like that. And Hinduism is not the actual age-old name of this tradition. Rather, the name of the tradition is Sanatana Dharma. And again, no Hindu would disagree with this. This is common knowledge. The term Sanatana Dharma, very specifically, is found in the Vedic scriptures. The word Hindu in Hinduism is not. They're not found anywhere in Sanskrit. These are not even Sanskrit terms. Rather, the term that you find is Sanatana Dharma, found as early as the Rig Veda, which is the earliest known writing in existence, in world existence. And the term Sanatana Dharma essentially means the eternal natural way. So again, the word Dharma itself meaning, let's say, the natural way or natural order, natural law, and then Sanatana meaning eternal. Thus, the actual name of what we today call Hinduism is Sanatana Dharma, the eternal natural way. What we have seen is that in the last certainly several hundred years, but then as time has gone on from then until today, exponentially what we've seen is that more and more people have been abandoning natural law. They've been abandoning the natural order in so many ways. Really, this has been going on for hundreds of years, but I like to especially point to the time of the so-called Enlightenment. So let's say roughly 17th, 18th century, around that time is when really we began a process of degeneration and of humanity as a whole beginning to abandon dharma, beginning to abandon the natural way, natural order. The primary way in which this was done, of course, was with an atheistic and materialistic attack on spirituality itself, which is really the very basis, the foundation of Dharma, really synonymous with Dharma, but also synonymous with how human beings are meant to live naturally. Many people have commented on this, and this is an indisputable fact. Human beings are naturally spiritual. We are meant to be spiritual. Other than in the 20th century, when one or two communist nations declare themselves officially atheistic, other than that sort of degenerate kind of phenomenon, all throughout the history of humanity, there has not been one people, one nation, one tribe, one group of individuals that did not practice spirituality and for whom spirituality was not in the center of everything that they did. Today, of course, it's very much the opposite. It's quite literally the opposite of natural law, of the natural order that we see being practiced within society today. Spirituality is no longer in the center of all things, in the center of society, center of culture, the center of governance, etc. Rather, materialism is. Materialism in many different forms, whether it's Western, let's say, liberal, democratic, capitalist consumerism, or whether it's overt communism, as we find in many communist nations like North Korea or the previous Soviet Union that no longer exists. What we see is that materialism, in one form or another, is in the center of society. And what we've seen as a result of this, of course, is suffering. Tremendous human suffering. We see this even today, but certainly within the 20th century as well. For those of us who are old enough to remember the 20th century and all the things that occurred, the 20th century was perhaps the century with more human suffering than has ever been experienced. And precisely because of materialism and the various wars of materialism. So yes, we have come a very long way and fallen a very long way from this natural order that once prevailed. Hmm. Sure, that's a good question. No, I would not blame technology directly because, of course, technology itself is simply a tool. Really, in actuality, what is to blame are human beings who, unfortunately, are undisciplined and have decided to give in to the fever of materialism and who have used technology for ill rather than good. The truth of the matter is, even in ancient times, there was technology. There was architecture, there was art, there was science, there was mathematics. If we talk about ancient Greco-Roman times, if we talk about ancient India, ancient China, all of these ancient nations, they had their technologies as well. So technology has always existed. Of course, the growth of technology in the last 100 years has been unprecedented. But still, just like with any tool, it's the person wielding the tool who determines whether it will be used for good or for ill. So a perfect example is a gun. A gun is a neutral object. It's just a thing. It's just a tool. As far as whether that tool will be used to harm someone in an unjust sort of way or to save someone's life completely depends upon the individual. So in the same way, the predicament that we find ourselves in now with rampant materialism and depression and human suffering on a massive scale. No, it's not due to technology. It's due to the people wielding the technology. Right now, we're using technology, obviously. Right now, we're using camera equipment and all sorts of equipment, editing equipment. We will be on the internet, airing this on the internet. Thus, we're using technology for good. But of course, with the birth of the internet, I like to point this out to my students once in a while because it's so tragic, it's almost humorous. On the internet today, however, the vast majority of individuals use the internet for what? Pornography. So here is a tool that can be used for good as we're using it right now, and yet the vast majority of people will just use it for pornography, this powerful instrument known as the internet. So is the internet good or bad? It's neither. What it is dependent upon is the individual who is using it. Well, it's true. Yes, I'm of 100% European descent. I'm half Italian and half Spanish. So, if anything, 100% Mediterranean European descent, actually. But born and raised in America, born and raised in New York City specifically. And as far as, let's say, both my own interest in Vedic spirituality, but also the fact that, yes, millions of other Westerners also are tremendously interested in Vedic spirituality and practice various forms, whether it's Sanatana Dharma or Buddhism or Jainism, yoga, etc. Yes, first I need to make a little caveat and explain that I take a very different approach to Vedic spirituality than other people do, and that is in this, that I personally don't see Vedic spirituality as being quote unquote Eastern or Asian or Indian in any way. It's due to the fact that I've studied it so in depth, both personally but also academically. I have a PhD that I achieved in religious studies. So I've studied this very in depth, and what I've seen is that Vedic spirituality specifically is not a spiritual or religious phenomenon that belongs only to quote unquote India. So in my practicing Vedic spirituality, I don't consider myself to be practicing an Indian religion or an Eastern religion. Rather, what I've seen is the further that you go back in time, the more expansive was the scope of Vedic spirituality, to the point where if you go back far enough, let's say thousands of years before Christ, this was the predominant religion upon the face of the earth, and more, this was the religion of the Indo-European peoples. Sanatana Dharma, the Vedic tradition, and many people know this is not even a controversial statement at this point, although people tend to forget, sometimes out of convenience, but the Vedic tradition was the religion of the Indo-European peoples. And that means the entire peoples, essentially ranging from what today is Ireland all the way to northern India and almost everything in between. So as far as I'm concerned, in following Sanatana Dharma, I am practicing ancient European religion, and more than just Europe, more than just a religion that was practiced within the geographic bounds of what we now call Europe. Rather, I am practicing the religion of the Indo-European people. God, yes. Yes, both ancient as well as even modern history as well. Again, this is another topic that probably would take about 5 hours to cover because, I mean, history, we have 5,000 years of written history alone, but then the Vedic tradition goes back way further than that. We actually have in the Vedic corpus, in the Vedic literature, we have the histories of all humanity going back actually hundreds of thousands of years. So it is a very vast topic. But yes, when it comes to, let's say, the Vedic view of history versus that of modern historians, many of who, as it is, unfortunately, of course, are corrupted ideologically by the fact that many historians, many so-called scholars, professors today specifically, are Marxists, cultural Marxists, crypto Marxists, at the very least radical liberals, who of course have an ideological bent in how they study history, and they will distort and rewrite and revise history in order to fit their ideological construct. That is the problem. So yes, we take a very different view of history. Beginning with the ancient world, again, Sanatana Dharma, Vedic tradition, does not believe in the idea of qualitative evolution, just as a starting point. We don't believe in cavemen. We don't believe in many of the modern ideas that have come about in the last roughly 150 years or so. Rather, again, we have history books that talk about the histories of humanity and our heritage going back hundreds of thousands of years at a time before modern man was supposed to have even existed. We have stories of kings, and this is not mythology. These are actual histories contained in a collection of books called the Puranas, which mean the histories, and the histories specifically of the Indo-European peoples. So when it comes to ancient history, yes, we differ quite a bit from more modern concepts. Again, we also know for a fact that if you go back roughly 5,000 years ago, much of the known world was indeed Vedic, either directly or indirectly practicing the Vedic tradition in one way or another. The remnants of this in Europe is found in what we today call paganism. That is, for example, Asatru, the paganism of Northern Europe, of the Nordic people. This is found in the Druidic tradition of the Celtic people. This is found in the Slavic tradition, certainly in the Greco-Roman tradition. We consider these traditions to be the tail end remnants of what was at one time a nearly global Vedic tradition. So that's ancient times. And then when it comes to our take on modern history, yes, we have a lot of points of differentiation from most modern scholars, which again would take a long time to explain. But yes, our view of history is very different from what is taught, let's say, at the typical European or American university or high school, etc. Rather than the idea of a qualitative progressive evolution of humanity that has been basically the paradigmatic norm within Western academia for, again, 150 years or so, that is the idea that with each successive generation, human beings are qualitatively, morally, intellectually, culturally becoming more refined, becoming more sophisticated, becoming more wise, etc. This modern idea is, in our estimation, a fallacy. Vedic tradition teaches literally the opposite. And truthfully, even just the empirical evidence around us, literally what we see with our own eyes, shows us that the opposite is indeed the case. Human beings are not getting better. Human beings have been getting worse. Worse in every way, and specifically qualitatively. Of course, someone will try to throw in the argument, well, but we have iPhones now. They didn't have iPhones 100 years ago. The technology has gotten better. Well, again, the tools have gotten somewhat better, faster, if you consider faster better. But human beings, qualitatively as human beings, have at the same time proportionally been getting worse in every way. Thus, what we have seen is a coarsening of culture from generation to generation, going back to at least the end of World War II, if not before then. People's interpersonal behavior has gotten worse. People's etiquette norms have gotten worse in every way. Even people's ability to discern and to use their intellectual faculties in order to judge and in order to come to truth is nowhere near as strong as it was in the past. At one time, individuals, at least many individuals, more than now, had the ability to think analytically. They had the ability to think philosophically. They had the ability to think independently and try to figure out what is happening in the world around them. Today, very few people have that ability anymore. We've seen this. We've seen a dumbing down of the human intellect. So qualitatively, yes, the Vedic tradition teaches that we're not evolving, rather we're devolving. Humans specifically, that's a good question, actually. I've never been asked that. There is an answer to it according to the Vedic tradition. And it's a long answer, but to give a very short answer, human beings came into existence as the result of a god. There was a god whose name was Manu. And human beings are considered in the Vedic tradition to be the descendants of Manu. Manu was the first man. And when we say man, we don't mean this in the gender sense. We mean man meaning human. Indeed, you get the word man from Manu. Man, Manu. Manu was the first man. He was the first human being as we would recognize human beings. Still, even then, actually, if we were to quote unquote meet this individual named Manu, he would seem very different from the typical human being who we know now. He would be much bigger, much taller, much more beautiful, much more effulgent, much more ethereal as well. But this was the first human who is responsible for the birth of the human race when he appeared, but it was millions of years ago, actually. So human beings, as we know them today, we could say, have been upon the earth for millions of years. But again, since Manu, there has been a qualitative decline in the nature of human beings. So indeed, if we were to see what human beings actually were like, let's say 10,000 years ago, we would just be awed by what human beings were like 10,000 years ago and then 100,000 years ago. But yes, that's considered to be the origin of human beings. Thus, one important Sanskrit word that is used for human is Manushya. Manushya, meaning of Manu, from Manu. And then its opposite is Amanushya, that is the negation of Manushya, meaning a subhuman. The German equivalent would be an Untermensch, Untermenschen, that is individuals who, while seeming human in form, do not act in a human sort of way. Thus, it's always been recognized that merely looking human does not necessarily make you human, but rather it's your behavioral characteristics and your spiritual attainments, in addition to how you actually look, that make you human. Yes, definitely, definitely. Yeah, the idea of reincarnation, what sometimes is called transmigration of consciousness, is a very, again, a very ancient, very universal tradition. This is an idea that you find not just in Asia, but in Europe as well. You know, the Celtic people, many Greco-Romans, many Greeks, many Romans believed in reincarnation. I would say the vast majority of ancient European cultures believed in reincarnation. And the idea of reincarnation, very simply, is the idea that, first of all, we are not these bodies. The body is akin to clothing. In the same way that we can be wearing really nice clothing one day and then very casual clothing the next day, and et cetera, et cetera. In the same way, our bodies are considered to be simply outer garments. In actuality, what constitutes the true person is consciousness, is the person who is lying within. That is, that individual who is within, who is the experiencer, who is experiencing all things. And then anything that is experienced is considered to be materiality. So this is how reincarnation works, is essentially the idea that it is a spark of consciousness. Each individual unit of consciousness basically reincarnates, cycles through these various bodies. And what determines how they reincarnate and why they reincarnate is the second term that always goes along with reincarnation of necessity, and that is karma. That is the idea that with every ethical action that we perform within this world, either good or bad, when we perform that ethical activity, we set into motion its opposite effect. So, in other words, when we do good, we can expect good to happen to us at some point in the future. When we do bad, we can expect bad to happen to us at some point in the future. And this is the thing, when we say the future, we mean the future. That result can occur either later in this lifetime, or it can occur in 5 lifetimes, 10 lifetimes, 1 lifetime from now, etc. It's very difficult to know. Nature always, of necessity, proceeds slowly. And this is considered to be a natural phenomenon, the phenomenon of karma and thus reincarnation. So as a result, what we see is that we, as individuals, by our actions and our activities, we create ourselves, we create our futures, and we create what we will be in the future, and thus we have different kinds of bodies. And yes, it's not always human bodies. Every living being of necessity is consciousness. If a thing is alive, it is alive because it is consciousness. There's no such thing as something alive without consciousness. Consciousness and life are synonymous. So what we see is that there is consciousness in certainly human beings, but also animals and plants, and then by extension, those beings that we cannot see with our naked eye, that is the gods and demons. And we, in accordance with our choices, with our free will, we have the ability to reincarnate either as humans again or as animals if we led a very ethically negative sort of life. Or we can actually be born as gods. We can be born as a god and live for 100,000 years and have a very, very lofty, very elevated sort of existence. Or we can be born in hellish realms. We can be born as demonic beings. This is why we have so many humans, for example, who are born as psychopaths and sociopaths. So yes, there's a very vast range of various sorts of lives, bodies in which we can be born. But the important thing is it's not a matter of fate. It's a matter of we, with our own free will, choose how we will be in the future and how we will be born in the future. A little bit of both. Certainly, if it comes to making ethically good versus ethically bad choices, Sanatana Dharma certainly encourages us to always choose the ethical path of goodness. So, in every way, we try to be as ethical as possible, as moral as possible, to always do the right thing, to always do that which is good, that which is beneficial to ourselves and others. At the same time, merely being an ethical being, an ethical person, is not in itself the goal. Rather, the goal is indeed enlightenment. Yes, it's very similar to Buddhism, which in itself was an offshoot of Sanatana Dharma, which I'm sure you and many of your viewers know. Buddhism is only 2,500 years old, and the Buddha himself was a follower of Sanatana Dharma. What he started only broke off from Sanatana Dharma generations after he passed away. But yes, the goal is very similar. We are here in order to become perfect. This is why we find ourselves existing. This is, one could say, the ultimate meaning of life. You know how for forever, for thousands of years, in every culture, in every civilization, you have individuals searching for the meaning of life. And according to Sanatana Dharma, this is the meaning of life. And I'll state it this bluntly. Again, it's very blunt. The meaning of life for us and why we find ourselves in this world is to become perfect. Absolutely perfect. And what that means is enlightenment. And when we say perfect, we're not talking about perfect in merely a quantitative sense. See, this is why the very idea of perfection scares a lot of people, and especially today, especially in our degenerate age of 2017, people are scared to death by the idea of perfection. No one even uses this term anymore, except for me and a few others. But when people think of perfection, they tend to think in a quantitative sense, meaning, oh, the strongest and the most handsome, etc., etc. That's not what is meant by perfection in the Vedic tradition or in any real spiritual tradition. What is meant by perfection is qualitative perfection. In other words, yes, what we would call enlightenment. That is, knowing eternal truth, knowing it perfectly, not merely intellectually, but deep within our hearts as a realization that we are then following to its perfection. And more, personifying truth in everything that we think, in everything that we say, in everything that we do. When we accomplish this, we have achieved enlightenment. We have achieved perfection. And at that point, at the end of that lifetime, once we have achieved that, the cycle of reincarnation comes to an end, and we have absolute and complete spiritual existential liberation from illusion, from ignorance, from pain, from imperfection. And that's the goal for every follower of Sanatana Dharma. Hmm. Oh, that's a good question. Several ways, actually. First of all, as far as what is considered morally right and morally wrong, many of these principles are contained within our scriptures themselves, within the Vedic scriptures. And it's very upfront, very black and white, it's not mysterious. There are certain activities that are considered to be wrong and evil. So, for example, just to give some obvious examples, to take the life of others without reason is considered to be wrong. To lie is considered to be wrong. Then conversely, to do good to others is considered to be a morally right thing to do. To be compassionate, to be empathetic, to give to the needy, and not just the needy, but specifically those who are worthy needy. In other words, those who truly are in poverty because of circumstances that have been outside of themselves, in order to help such individuals. That is considered to be ethical, etc. So this is one way in which we know what is considered to be right and wrong ethically, is because many of these principles are contained in the Vedic scriptures. The other way in which we know is, in addition, by philosophical discernment and by philosophical inference. That is, using the process in philosophy that is called ethics, that is, rationally trying to understand what are those human behavioral characteristics that lead to good, that lead to the good, the health, the prosperity, the harmony, the inner harmony, etc., of both the individual, but then society as a whole. That is what is considered to be good, what can be discerned to do that. And then conversely, what can be discerned, those behavioral characteristics that can be discerned to harm the individual, to harm the integrity of the individual, to harm the integrity of the society, of the people, etc. That's considered to be ethically bad. So it's a combination of several things. It is what is revealed in the Vedic scriptures. It's using our own intellectual discernment and rationality and logic. It is also personal insight and revelation as well. So it's a combination of these things that help us to determine what is ethically right and ethically wrong. Oh, that's a tremendous myth. Yes, this is a tremendous myth. It's very unfortunate. The person who essentially equated in the popular mind the idea of pacifism and the Vedic tradition was Mahatma Gandhi, who in many ways was a very nice person. He was a very good person. He had a few good ideas. However, many people unfortunately make the mistake of thinking that Gandhi was somehow some sort of spiritual teacher or spiritual leader within the Vedic tradition. He was not. He was not, and followers of the Vedic tradition don't consider him to be, and he himself never claimed to be. He was a politician. He was a politician, very idealistic person. And of course, he is the person who most linked the idea of direct pacifism, of actual pacifism, with what we call Hinduism. No, the truth of the matter is the Vedic tradition does not believe in pure pacifism. It believes in nonviolence in a reasonable sense, and that is that we certainly should not inflict violence upon others without reason. I mean, that's common sense for all people. If there's a person, a few feet away from you who's doing absolutely nothing to harm you, you wouldn't attack that person for no reason. So certainly the Vedic tradition believes in that sort of nonviolence. And in fact, if anything, this has been one of my frustrations when trying to explain the Vedic tradition to people who have a very surface level understanding of it. If anything, the thing that is amazing about the Vedic tradition is that it itself is a warrior tradition, what to speak of being pacifist. It itself is considered to be a warrior tradition. And in fact, I gave one lecture about this maybe 2 or 3 years ago that we put up as a YouTube video. That's been one of our most popular videos. Many tens of thousands of people have seen it, where for an hour I explain the entire history of warrior culture within the Vedic tradition. And yes, many of the most important people within our tradition were certainly spiritual people, but also warriors at the same time. So yes, we believe in a warrior ethos. We believe in defending ourselves. We believe in training in a martial sort of way. Some of the most powerful forms of martial arts came from the Vedic tradition, both directly and indirectly. So yes, we do not believe in pacifism. We believe in a warrior ethos in Sanatana Dharma. Oh, sure. And the two can be reconciled, interestingly. A person can indeed be a compassionate warrior, meaning that, first of all, to be a compassionate warrior, what does this look like for the individual? What does this actually mean? What it means is a warrior who has perfect self-control. In other words, a warrior who necessarily is a spiritual person. The perfect warrior is an individual who externally, martially, is trained in every form of fighting, in every form of weaponry, and every form of tactic, military strategy. It means a person who physically is very strong and can defend themselves in every way, etc. But at the same time, a warrior also has to be a person who internally has enormous discipline, has enormous focus, has a very strong ethical center, and thus will only use all of that skill, all of that martial skill, when necessary to do the right thing. Otherwise, for a true warrior, they're motivated by compassion. That is, when they even engage in battle, why are they doing it? See, unfortunately, in the last several hundred, several thousand years, we could say, much of The history of war has been wars of acquisition, wars in which you try to just steal, take over other people's lands, other people's wealth, etc., etc. The true warrior ethos, on the other hand, teaches that the reason why you go to war is to defend good, is to defend Dharma, to defend the natural way, to defend your own people. You don't simply go to war because you're a greedy, bored sort of warrior and you just want to bully others. That's not a true warrior. Rather, what it means to be a compassionate warrior is that when you go to war, it is to defend the innocent. It is to defend civilization, to defend culture, to defend beauty, to defend that which is worthy of defense, worthy of preserving. And that in itself is an act of compassion. Because what are you trying to do as a warrior? You're trying to preserve those elements of society that need, under all circumstances, to be passed down to future generations, and thus keep our children and our children's children also civilized. So that's compassion. They are in a very difficult position. On the one hand, I think it's very good for young men who want to exercise their warrior spirit to the best way of doing that, and that is to join the military of their nation. There aren't many other venues in which a person can fully express themselves as a warrior. So on the one hand, yes, I encourage people to do that. In fact, I have disciples who are in the military. I have disciples who are in the Marines, other branches of the military, and they themselves have very much a warrior, or what in Sanskrit we would call a kshatriya sort of temperament. So we encourage people to do that, join the military on the one hand. On the other hand, it's true that the vast majority of wars that have taken place have not taken place for just reasons. They have not taken place truly on behalf of the people, of the nations that these wars supposedly were taking place on behalf of. Most of the wars that have taken place in the 21st century and certainly in the 20th century have been unjustified. They have been wars that have been caused not due to a natural sense of defending the people, but rather in order to impose an unnatural order upon the world, what some people, myself included, would call a new world order. This is a very unethical reason to engage in war. To address your question directly, what does an individual do when they find themselves in such a circumstance? They need to follow their conscience, is what I would say. They need to follow their conscience. Militaries exist really not, especially in modern times, not merely to serve politicians. That is what they do, unfortunately. That is the role of militaries today. They serve interests of corrupt and evil politicians. However, that's not their function. Militaries, whether it's the American military, Canadian military, the military of the UK, etc., their allegiance is to the people of those nations. And above all, any individual has to keep that in mind if they're in the military. You must serve the people. It is indeed possible, but not without tremendous difficulty in many circumstances. First, as far as the concept of the Kali Yuga itself. Yes, this is a term that has now become prevalent in, let's say, nationalistic, conservative, traditionalist circles now for the last, maybe 80 years or so, as a result of individuals like René Guénon, Julius Evola, and other writers like this. However, the term itself, of course, Kali Yuga, is itself a Vedic term. It's a Sanskrit term, and they themselves acknowledge this. The concept of the Kali Yuga is itself a Vedic concept. And very briefly, maybe let me just explain what that concept actually is, and not just from the Western traditionalist school perspective, but what it truly means. And that is this. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that humanity has been going through stages, stage upon stage upon stage of qualitative devolution for a very, very long time. And more than this, we also recognize that history proceeds cyclically. In other words, there are cycles within history. And very specifically within the Vedic tradition, and not just the Vedic tradition, most ancient traditions agree with this, what I'm about to say, there are 4 ages specifically that humanity goes through. The first of these is what is called the Golden Age, what all people historically have recognized as the Golden Age. But then the last of these 4 ages is the age that we are living in today, what in Sanskrit is called the Kali Yuga. This is the age of conflict. This is the most degenerate of all ages. It is the darkest of ages. It is the qualitatively most inferior of the ages. It is an age in which, in almost every way, the Kali Yuga is the mirror opposite of the Golden Age. And as a result of this, it makes living a dignified life very difficult. The fact that we are in this age with this atmosphere of materialism and degeneracy, spiritual moral degeneracy, it makes the project of individuals trying to live meaningful lives very challenging. Because what do you do when you find yourself an individual born in this age who, due to good karma, but more just who you are, you find yourself with tremendous discomfort in this age. You find yourself in an age, in a culture in which everything is alien to you, everything is opposite to your values. You yourself want to be a person who is living a life of meaning and beauty and spirituality, and yet you see that everything around you is geared toward the opposite. This leads to tremendous frustration on the part of many sensitive, intelligent, wise individuals. Many of them just don't know what to do. And different people have had different answers as far as what to do. So for example, Julius Evola famously recommended that we ride the tiger, that we basically just go on with our lives and ignore politics, ignore the world around us. That's not the path that I teach people. Rather, the idea is this: finding that we are Golden Age citizens living within the Kali Yuga. We ourselves are meant in our own lives to replicate the Golden Age as much as is feasible, as much as is possible. It is challenging to live a life of dignity, to live a life of meaning in a world without meaning, but we must do so nonetheless. And the way that we do this is in every big and small way in our lives. We try to make our lives spiritual. We try to make our lives full of meaning. We ourselves live as Arya, as noble beings, as individuals who personify in ourselves, in our own lives, Dharma, or the natural way. Even if all of society has abandoned Dharma, we ourselves are meant to live as if we are personifying Dharma. And in this way, we as individuals, personally, we find ourselves to be content and happy despite living in this dark age, but also we serve as beacons of hope to others as well. We serve as beacons of hope to those individuals who, like us, find themselves disquieted by this horrible age. And we allow other people to know you're not alone. You're not alone. You who recognize the darkness in which we're living, you're not alone. And in fact, if anything, this is one of the salvations of our age, is indeed to now gather as many individuals as possible who really know what's going on in the world, who quite literally hate modernity because they see it as nothing but dark and degenerate, and to have such individuals come together and change the situation. And we can indeed change the situation. So that's the answer to what we do. Sure, definitely. You're referring to the Dharma Manifesto, I believe, and yes, that's a book that I wrote that came out in 2013, so just a few years ago, about 4 years ago or so. And the Dharma Manifesto is a very interesting book. I've written at this point about a dozen books. The Dharma Manifesto has been one of the books of mine that has had the biggest impact in the world. The book itself is published by Arctos, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Arctos Media. Again, it came out in 2013, and the idea of the book was this: to present a political manifesto, a very practical political manifesto for how to do precisely what we were just talking about a moment ago, how to bring light to the Kali Yuga. But again, not just in, let's say, a philosophical or airy-fairy or merely spiritual sort of way, but very practically in the realm of politics, real politics, engaged politics in the world. So the Dharma Manifesto is a unique book in that it takes the most ancient principles, the most ancient teachings, the most ancient worldview of the Indo-European people, and it applies those to today, to quite literally our age, right now. And the book itself is meant to explain to people what we need to do in order to set up what I call Dharma nations. That is, nations throughout the world who govern in accordance with natural law. And natural law nations, Dharma nations, are something that we have not seen upon the earth for many, many, many years. Many years. Right now, I can conclusively say there is not one Dharma nation upon the earth. There is not one nation that governs in accordance with natural law. That's about to change. That is about to change. Part of the reason is because of the Dharma Manifesto, but more than that, part of the reason is also because many thousands of individuals, like yourself, for example, like many people in your audience, like many of the other wonderful people who I've seen that you've interviewed. I've watched many, many of the interviews that you've done. And it's inspiring to know that there are so many thousands of people, and not just people, intelligent people, the sorts of people who I've described, people who are born intelligent, sensitive, spiritual, who they understand that there is something bizarre and unnatural happening around them, and they want to change the world. It's going to be as a result of such individuals that the vision of the Dharma Manifesto will become manifest. And we will begin to see sane governments again. Governments in which the nation state is geared toward the well-being of the people of that nation state. That's something we have not had for a very long time. And it's something that we will begin to have again. Oh, that's a deep philosophical question. How to define evil? I'll define it in brief. Essentially, what evil is the free will conscious decision to cause undue harm to others. And that in itself motivated by a false sense of ego, a false sense of self-centeredness, a sense that my pleasure, my well-being, what I desire in life takes precedence over anything else, any other principle, any other person. That in itself, that mindset, is the root foundation, one could say, of evil. So evil is more so than just an activity. It is a poison of the mind. It's a poison of the soul. It is a conscious free will decision, again, to make self-centeredness the center of your life, rather than thinking about the well-being of others. That, by definition, is evil. And then, of course, the activities that are performed by such individuals are evil activities. So it's interesting, just as an ethical, interesting little problem, actually, I've pointed this out to people. Evil is not merely what is done. Certainly there are evil actions. If you take an innocent baby and harm that baby, that's an evil action, etc. However, evil itself ultimately, again, lies within the individual. And this is the example I've given to people. Imagine that you take an individual who is the evilest psychopath, the evilest sociopath that you can imagine, and you place that individual on a deserted island where they are the only person living there. And they have no one who they can harm. This is the question. Is that person still evil? And the answer, of course, is yes. And why is that person still evil? Well, they may not be in a position where they can engage in the activity of evil because there's no one around them to harm. However, within, if they could, they would, and they desire to harm. And the moment that there is another individual who is presented to them, they will try to harm that person. So that's evil. Evil is something that exists within the person. It's not merely the activities. The activities, certainly there are evil activities, but those are secondary. Those are the fruit, one could say, of an evil heart. Yes, according to the Vedic perspective, there is indeed a difference between, in fact, several interrelated things. And let me maybe list these: emotions versus mind versus intellect versus ego versus consciousness itself. And without going very deeply into what is actually a very deep, both metaphysical but also ontological topic, let me just say this: there is a distinction between all of those things. And it's very unfortunate that this was recognized previously in pagan times in European culture. However, for the last roughly several hundred years in Western philosophy, these various factors of the human person are kind of muddled. So let's deal with the least important of these. Emotion. Emotion is ephemeral. Emotion is of no importance, really. Emotion is something that it's like a wisp of fog that overcomes us for some time. And let's say we get very angry, but then the anger leaves. We get very sad, but then the sadness eventually leaves, etc. Then going up one step further, there is mind. What in Sanskrit is called manas or mind. Mind is the storehouse of information. Mind is where memory is kept, for example. It's where, when we learn something, whether it's something through the senses, whether it's reading something, it's where all the information is stored. That's mind. Now, intellect itself. Intellect is that principle within the person that orders all of that information that is contained in mind. Thus, intellect is capable of analysis, capable of rational thought, capable of logical propositional analysis, discernment, etc. So that's what intellect is, and it's considered to be something higher than merely mind itself. In Sanskrit, intellect is called buddhi. It comes from the same verb root as buddha, but that's what intellect is. Now, consciousness itself, interestingly, is considered to be radically, ontologically above and distinct from all of these other elements. It is nothing like emotion or mind or intellect or even ego. Consciousness itself is considered to be transmaterial. In other words, it's something that transcends all materiality. Consciousness is eternal. Consciousness in and of itself is perfect. And more than this, again, as I was saying when we first started our conversation, every living being ultimately is consciousness. We are not merely the body. How do we know this? Well, the body's temporary. Where was your body 40 years ago? Well, it was non-existent. Where will your body be 1,000 years from now? I hope you live a very long time, but most likely your body won't be in existence 1,000 years from now. Neither will mine. We're not the body. We are not the emotions. We're not merely the mind, that storehouse of information. And we're not merely analytical robots. We're not merely thinking things. Rather, what the Vedic tradition teaches is that we are pure consciousness. And another name for consciousness is experiencer. We are that being who is experiencing all things that are happening around us and to us. So we are experiencing through the body, and we are experiencing physical sensations. When we close our eyes and we're thinking, we are experiencing those things that are stored in the mind and that we then try to make sense of with the intellect, etc., etc. We are ultimately that experiencer, that person, in other words, who, while everything around us is changing, and not just physical things, again, our own mind changes, our intellect changes, our emotions change, we are that being who, when everything around us is changing, we are not. We are ever present. And we, while truly, certainly engaging in the world more, we are experiencing everything that's happening. That is the true us. According to the Vedic tradition, but also yoga psychology as well, we ultimately are that consciousness. And that consciousness is eternal. That consciousness in and of itself is already perfect. That consciousness is of the nature of bliss, of the nature of beauty, and of pretty much every other positive attribute that we can think of. That is who we are. What in the West is sometimes called soul or spirit. The only difference being this: in the modern West, and I have to say the modern West, the pagans, agreed with Vedic spirituality, but in the modern West, the idea is that you have a soul. in the same way that you have a spleen, in the same way that you have ribs, you have a soul. The Dharmic tradition, the Vedic tradition, on the other hand, says that no, it's not that you have a soul, it's that you are soul. It's not that you have consciousness, rather you are consciousness. So that's what consciousness is. Yes. Yeah, let me explain this by maybe giving this analogy. Imagine that you were born a queen. In fact, not just a queen, but a mighty queen. You are the queen of an empire. And what does that mean? Well, all of the accoutrements that then accompany being a queen. You have tremendous wealth, you have followers, you have armies at your command, etc. But at some point, you decide, just in order to have fun, to kind of dress as a commoner and go among the common people without telling anyone. And as you are doing that and you find yourself in a public square dressed like a commoner and no one knows who you are, you happen to have an accident, you fall down, you hit your head. Now you have amnesia. You have forgotten that you are a queen. People have forgotten that they are queens and that they are kings. People have forgotten that they are consciousness. Now this is the thing. You are still the queen. You still are who you are. You still have those armies at your command. You still have that wealth at your command. You still have all the accoutrements, all of the beneficial things that the queen has. But right now, you're an illusion. Right now, you are forgotten who you truly are. You have forgotten your true identity. So in that scenario, your goal, of course, should be to remember who you truly are. As you're wandering around, you know that you don't know who you are because you can't even remember your name or your background, your history. Well, in the same way that a person with amnesia under medical supervision would go through a process of little by little beginning to remember who they are. So for example, doctors will reintroduce them to things from their actual life that they should remember and that will hopefully jog their memory. In the same way, spiritually, this is what's called spiritual practice. Spiritually, we engage in spiritual practices such as meditation, yoga practices, etc., in order to jog our spiritual memory. Right now, we are perfect beings under the illusion that we are imperfect. And that is what's called illusion, what in Sanskrit is called maya, that which is not. We have misidentified our true self in the same way that that queen thinks that she is a commoner, and that's how she's identifying ourselves. We have made the mistake of, as pure consciousness, through illusion, identifying ourselves with that which we are not. So we think that we are all these material things. We practice spirituality in order to remember our true identity and to free ourselves. So that's the process. My pleasure. Thank you so much. Sure, definitely. Well, we do have a YouTube channel. It's simply called Dharma Nation, all one word. So if they go to youtube.com/Dharma Nation, that's our YouTube channel where we have many of our videos. And then we have many websites, but the primary one is Dharma Central, all one word. Dharma as in the word I've been using, and then central.com. And if they go there, they can find many of my books available and much, much more information about this spiritual path.